Imagine a man standing before his city, unarmed, unafraid, and already condemned. He is 70 years old, barefoot, plain in dress, surrounded by stone and noise. Before him, 500 Athenian jurors sit in judgment. Behind him, the city of Athens hums, the proudest democracy on earth. The birthplace of reason, now preparing to silence the one man who taught it to think. His name is Socrates, and on this day, Athens will kill him for words. It was not the first time a city destroyed its prophet, but it was the first time the world called it philosophy. For 40 years, Socrates had wandered the streets of Athens, the markets, the workshops, the wrestling schools, speaking to anyone who would listen, and especially to those who wouldn't. He asked questions that sounded simple but cut like razors. What is justice? What is virtue? What is truth? And when men tried to answer, he would take their words apart until nothing remained but doubt. He never wrote a book. He never charged a coin. He never claimed to know anything. But in a city that worshipped confidence and rhetoric, his ignorance was revolutionary. Athens was not always a kind place for thinkers. The Peloponnesian War had left it scarred. A generation of dead sons, lost colonies, and broken faith. The city that had once defeated Persia and built the Parthenon now lived in fear of itself. Its democracy had turned inward, suspicious of voices that questioned too much. Socrates questioned everything. He was not handsome. His nose was broad, his eyes bulged, his feet were bare. But his mind moved like lightning. He could expose hypocrisy with a sentence, unravel an argument with silence. He spoke with the calm of someone who knew that truth was more important than comfort. He believed that wisdom began with recognizing one's own ignorance, that the unexamined life was not worth living. To him, truth was not a possession but a pursuit. Every question was a doorway, and he opened them one after another until those around him could no longer bear the light. He humiliated politicians, embarrassed poets, and made generals doubt themselves. In the agora, people gathered not to hear him speak, but to watch others fail to answer. To the young, he was fascinating, a man who defied authority and seemed untouchable. To the powerful, he was dangerous, a living mirror that reflected their pretensions. And in a city struggling to recover from war, humiliation was an unforgivable sin. His enemies multiplied. They whispered that he corrupted the youth, that he mocked the gods, that his questions undermined the city's faith. They pointed to his former students, Alcibiades, the brilliant general who betrayed Athens, and Critias, who led the bloody oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. To his accusers, these were not coincidences. They were evidence, but Socrates never defended them. He said only that he taught people to think, and what they did with thought was their own affair. To understand why that was enough to condemn him, you must understand Athens. This was the birthplace of democracy. Yes, but also of public opinion, envy, and fear. The same citizens who built the Parthenon could tear down a man's life with a vote. In Athens, the jury was not 12. It was hundreds, and they loved nothing more than a good trial. When the charges came, they were almost laughable. Socrates was accused of impiety, of not believing in the city's gods, and of corrupting the youth by teaching them to question authority. But beneath those words was a deeper accusation, that he made people think for themselves. To Athens, still nursing its wounds from civil strife, that was treason. He could have fled. He could have softened his speech, begged forgiveness, offered sacrifice to the gods. Others had done so and lived. But Socrates refused. He said it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it. If truth required his death, then death would be his proof. And so he walked into court as calmly as if to have a conversation. His friends pleaded with him to prepare a defense. He told them not to worry, that the gods would decide, and that no harm could come to a good man, in life or after death. The trial lasted 1 day. His words would echo for millennia. But to understand why he stood so calmly before his judges, we must return to where it began, to the dusty streets of Athens, decades earlier, when a strange, barefoot man first began to ask questions no one else dared to. Because before he became the world's most famous prisoner, Socrates had already built his revolution, not with weapons, but with words. Long before he stood trial, before his name became a monument, Socrates was just another citizen of Athens. No one looking at him would have guessed his future. He owned no land. He worked with his hands as a stonemason. He was married to a woman named Xanthippe, who, legend says, scolded him constantly for his poverty and his obsession with conversation. He was not born into power or privilege. He belonged to the artisan class, the backbone of Athens, but not its voice. The Athens of his youth was unlike any city before it. When Socrates was born, around 470 BC, the city was entering its golden age. The Persian Wars were over. The empire of Athens stretched across the Aegean. Its navy ruled the seas, its art and architecture defined beauty itself. Under the leadership of Pericles, democracy flowered. Every citizen had a voice, and the city seemed invincible. To walk through Athens in those days was to walk through a living idea. Marble temples rose on the Acropolis like thoughts made solid. Statues gleamed in the sunlight. Poets performed in crowded theaters, dramatizing the struggles of gods and men. In the marketplace, the agora, merchants, soldiers, slaves, and philosophers mingled in the same dust. The air was filled with arguments. In that noise, Socrates found his calling. He had been taught by philosophers of the older generation, Anaxagoras, who said the sun was not a god but a ball of fire, and Archelaus, who taught that the world was shaped by natural law, not divine whim. These were dangerous ideas in a city still ruled by myth. Socrates absorbed them, but he took them further. He turned philosophy from the sky to the soul. Others asked what the universe was made of. He asked what we are made of. He fought as a soldier before he became a philosopher. He served bravely in 3 campaigns, Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis, where he was known for endurance and courage. He marched barefoot through snow, carried wounded comrades from the field, and stood guard longer than men half his age. His fellow soldier Alcibiades, who would later betray Athens, wrote that Socrates was the bravest man he had ever seen, but war left him unmoved by glory. He returned home with a single conviction, that virtue mattered more than victory. The courage that won battles meant nothing if the soul that fought them was corrupt. And so, while others built monuments to power, Socrates began his campaign against ignorance. He did not teach in schools. He had none. His classroom was the street. His tools were questions. He would approach anyone, statesmen, merchants, poets, priests, and ask them what they believed. What is justice? What is beauty? What is goodness? When they answered, he would probe deeper, uncovering contradictions until their certainty collapsed. This was the Socratic method, not teaching, but midwifery of thought. He called himself a midwife of the mind, helping others give birth to truth they already carried without knowing it. He was relentless. To him, conversation was battle, not to defeat others, but to liberate them from illusion. He believed the soul was immortal, that truth existed beyond opinion, and that virtue was the only true wealth. Gold and fame meant nothing if the mind was blind. To some, he was inspiring. To others, unbearable. Politicians feared him because he made them look foolish in public. Sophists, paid teachers who sold rhetoric for profit, hated him because he taught for free and exposed their tricks. The poets despised him for mocking their divine inspiration. Yet even his enemies admitted his influence was vast. Young men followed him through the city like disciples. Plato, Xenophon, Crito, Antisthenes, eager to hear him debate and to see who he would humiliate next. To them, Socrates was proof that a man could be free even in a city of laws. But Athens was changing. The same democracy that had once fostered brilliance was beginning to corrode. Wealth divided citizens. The empire that had united Greece now ruled it through fear. The Peloponnesian War, fought against Sparta, drained Athens for nearly 30 years. Pestilence swept through the city, killing Pericles and thousands more. In those years, Socrates became a living paradox, a man who served the state in battle but defied it in peace. He refused to write laws, refused to run for office, refused to flatter anyone. When the 30 tyrants, a short-lived oligarchy, ordered him to arrest an innocent man, he refused, an act that could have cost him his life. He told his students that virtue was knowledge, that no one did evil willingly, but only out of ignorance. It was a radical thought. If true, it meant that morality could be taught, that goodness was not inherited or commanded by the gods, but reasoned through. It was democracy taken to its logical extreme. If every citizen could think, every citizen could be wise. But that ideal frightened the city that had invented it. To the politicians, Socrates was not a philosopher. He was a threat. He questioned the gods in public, mocked the myths that bound the people together, and taught the youth to challenge authority. And worst of all, his influence reached the wrong kind of men. Brilliant, ambitious men who later betrayed Athens. When Alcibiades defected to Sparta, the public blamed Socrates. When Critias ruled Athens through blood, the public blamed Socrates again. They forgot that he had defied the tyrants, that he had never sought power. It was enough that he had taught them how to think. By the time the war ended, Athens was broken. Economically, politically, spiritually. The people who had once prided themselves on questioning everything now wanted stability, order, conformity. They turned to religion, to superstition, to the comfort of simple answers. Socrates offered none. Each morning, he rose before dawn and walked barefoot through the agora. He sought not comfort but clarity, not followers but understanding. When men mocked him, he laughed. When they insulted him, he thanked them for revealing their ignorance. To him, every argument was a prayer to truth. But truth makes a poor company for power, and as Athens struggled to rebuild its pride, the city's patience with its philosopher grew thin. The young continued to gather around him. The old grew jealous. The politicians began to whisper. They remembered how easily the crowd could be turned by speeches, how swiftly a vote could become a sentence, and somewhere in that restless city, the plan to silence him began, because in a democracy, there is one thing more dangerous than tyranny, a mind that refuses to obey it. By the time Athens put Socrates on trial, the city was exhausted, proud, wounded, and afraid. The Peloponnesian War had ended in humiliation. Sparta had torn down Athens' walls. Its navy was gone, its treasury empty, its empire scattered. The city that once ruled the seas now ruled only itself, and even that control was fragile. For a generation, the Athenians had watched their dreams crumble, first in war, then in politics. They had seen their democracy overthrown by oligarchs, restored by blood, and poisoned by distrust. The streets were filled with bitterness. Everyone blamed someone, and in the midst of this chaos stood an old man who claimed to know nothing, and yet could make anyone doubt everything. He had lived through their triumphs and their defeats. He had fought beside their heroes, outlived their tyrants, and refused to flatter their leaders. To some he was a sage, to others a heretic, to most a nuisance. But Athens was tired of questions. It wanted certainty again. It wanted to believe that its gods, its laws, and its customs were still sacred, that what had gone wrong could be blamed on someone else. And when a city looks for someone to blame, it always finds him. The first to speak his name was Anytus, a powerful politician and leather merchant. He had fought for democracy during the tyranny of the 30 and helped restore it. But he hated Socrates, not because of politics, but because of influence. His own son had fallen under the philosopher's spell, abandoning business and ambition to chase wisdom. To a man like Anytus, that was corruption. Then came Meletus, a young poet, vain and indignant, who saw in the trial a chance for fame. And Lycon, a rhetorician representing the orators, those masters of persuasion whom Socrates had spent years exposing as frauds. Together, they formed a coalition of resentment, politicians, poets, and orators, the very people Socrates had most often humiliated in public. They shared nothing but a common hatred of the man who made them feel small. They accused him of two crimes: impiety, not believing in the gods of the city, and corrupting the youth by teaching them to question authority. But behind those words lay a deeper charge, that he had become the conscience of Athens, and that the city could no longer bear to hear it. They summoned him before the Heliaia, the great people's court, a jury of 501 citizens chosen by lot. There would be no lawyers, no appeals, no judge to temper emotion, just the crowd, the accusers, and the man they called the gadfly. When word spread that Socrates was to stand trial, the city buzzed. People poured into the agora to speculate. Some came to see justice done, others to see a spectacle. His students pleaded with him to prepare a defense. He refused. "I have nothing to defend," he told them, only to explain. He would not flatter his accusers or appeal to pity. He would not beg for his life. That, he said, would betray everything he had ever taught. The day of the trial dawned clear and hot. The court convened in the heart of Athens, beneath the open sky. The accusers spoke first. Anytus thundered about duty and tradition, how Athens had been betrayed from within by arrogance and disbelief. Meletus pointed to Socrates' students, men like Alcibiades and Critias, and asked if it was coincidence that those who learned from him had turned against the city. Lycon ridiculed him as a corrupter of morals, a man who mocked the gods and twisted words to escape truth. Each accusation struck a chord. The crowd murmured. They had lost sons in war, fortunes in conquest, and faith in their democracy. And here was a man who told them they knew nothing. Then it was Socrates' turn. He stood calmly, barefoot as always, and began to speak. His voice was steady, his tone conversational, almost amused. He said he did not teach. He only asked questions. He said he believed in the gods more deeply than his accusers did, but not in the childish myths that passed for religion. He believed in a divine order, a guiding spirit, a daimonion that warned him against wrongdoing. He reminded them that he had never charged a fee, never claimed to be wise, never sought office. I am wiser, he said, only in this, that I know nothing. He compared himself to a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse that was Athens, to keep it awake, questioning, alive. If they killed him, he warned, they would lose the one voice that held them accountable to their ideals. Some laughed. Others scowled. The jurors whispered among themselves. He spoke not to persuade, but to bear witness. He told them that if the city commanded him to stop philosophizing, he would disobey, for obedience to truth was higher than obedience to men. He had risked his life before in battle. He would not abandon his duty now out of fear. He asked them to consider what justice really meant, whether it was the will of the majority or something greater. I am not defending myself, he said. I am defending you against the mistake you are about to make. The crowd stirred. His words were clear, but his defiance was fatal. When he finished, the jurors voted. 281 found him guilty. 220 voted to acquit. A narrow margin, but enough. Then came the second vote, the penalty. In Athens, the condemned could propose their own punishment. Most men offered exile or a fine. Socrates, smiling faintly, suggested that instead of punishment, he should be rewarded, given free meals in the Prytaneum, the Hall of Heroes, for serving the city by challenging its ignorance. The crowd erupted. The jurors voted again. This time the margin was wider. The sentence, death. He nodded as if accepting a familiar truth. No one in that court understood what they had done. They believed they had silenced a nuisance. Instead, they had immortalized him. That evening, his students wept. Plato, who was ill that day, would later call the trial the turning point of philosophy. For it showed that wisdom and power could not coexist. That truth, in the wrong city, was treason. As the sun set over Athens, Socrates thanked his judges for proving his point, that most men would rather kill an idea than confront it. He told them he bore no anger, only pity, that he was not afraid of death, because death was either a dreamless sleep or a journey to another world, where he might continue his questioning among wiser souls. And with that, the court was dismissed, the crowd dispersed. Athens went home to dinner. But in one small cell beneath the city, a philosopher sat cross-legged, waiting for the final conversation of his life. The city slept. The torches along the Acropolis flickered low. Somewhere beyond the walls, the cicadas sang to an indifferent night. In a narrow stone cell beneath the prison of Athens, Socrates waited. He had been found guilty of impiety and corruption. His sentence was death by hemlock. But execution in Athens was not immediate. It was delayed until the sacred ship that carried offerings to the island of Delos returned, a voyage made each year to honor Apollo. Until the ship's return, no death sentences could be carried out. So for 30 days, Socrates lived in the shadow of death, as calmly as he had lived in the shadow of truth. His friends came daily to visit. Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, Phaedo, young men who had followed him for years, now desperate to save him. They begged him to flee. The guards could be bribed, the borders crossed. There were places he could hide, cities that would welcome him. Socrates smiled. Where could I go? He asked. Where the sun does not shine and men do not talk. To run would be to betray everything he had taught. To escape the law even an unjust one, would be to declare that justice was nothing but convenience. Would I teach my students that truth is precious and then barter my life for safety? He said. No, it is better to die for principle than to live without it. They argued through the bars, voices breaking. He remained unmoved. The hour of departure has arrived, he said, and we go our ways. I to die, you to live. Which is better? Only the gods know. Those who visited him later said he seemed lighter each day, as though shedding his body even before death could claim it. He still asked questions, still teased them about their fears. You speak as though death were evil, he said once. But tell me, is all that is unknown evil? Perhaps it is the beginning of wisdom. He spent his last days as he had spent his life, in conversation. On the morning of his death, the sacred ship returned. The city resumed its executions. The guards came to his cell, hesitant, ashamed. They admired him, even loved him. They asked for forgiveness. Socrates thanked them and took a bath. He said he wanted to spare his wife and friends the burden of washing his body later. He dressed simply, as always, and sat on the bed, waiting. When his friends entered, they found him serene. Plato, who would later record these moments in the Phaedo, said he looked not like a man about to die, but like a man preparing for a journey. They wept. He laughed gently. Strange men, he said. I sent the women away so there would be no crying, and now you cry like them. He told them again that the soul was immortal, that it leaves the body as a freed prisoner leaves a cage. He described death not as an end, but as a purification, the moment when reason is released from the noise of the flesh. If death is nothing more than sleep, he said, then it is a gift. And if it is a passage to another life, where I might speak again with Homer, Hesiod, and all who have sought wisdom before me, what better reward could I wish for? The jailer entered quietly, carrying a small cup of dark liquid. He apologized. It was his duty. Socrates took the cup without hesitation. What must I do? He asked. Walk until your legs grow heavy, the jailer said. Then lie down. Socrates nodded. He raised the cup. Let us pray to the gods that my departure from this life to the next will be fortunate. Then he drank. Plato wrote that he drained it easily, without flinching, as if drinking water after a long walk. He handed the cup back, then began to pace the cell, waiting for the poison to reach his heart. His friends could not speak. Crito covered his face. Phaedo watched in silence. The jailer touched Socrates' leg and pressed it lightly. Do you feel that? Socrates shook his head. The numbness crept upward. Legs, waist, chest. When it reaches the heart, the jailer said softly, you will be gone. Socrates lay back on the bed. His last words were to Crito. We owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it is paid. Asclepius was the god of healing. The meaning was clear. Death, to him, was a cure, the final healing of the soul. A moment later, he stopped breathing. Plato wrote that his face changed not at all. He died peacefully, as one who had fallen asleep. Outside, Athens continued as if nothing had happened. The crowds bartered, the orators shouted, the soldiers drilled. In the cell, his students sat in silence, staring at the body that had changed the course of human thought. They had watched him live without fear, and now they had watched him die without it. The city had silenced its gadfly, but too late. His words had already taken root in minds that would outlive marble and empire. In the days that followed, the jurors who condemned him began to regret their decision. Some took their own lives, others fled the city. Athens, the teacher of Greece, had murdered its own conscience. Plato fled to Megara, carrying with him not scrolls or relics, but a method, a way of questioning that could never again be chained. He would spend his life turning his master's death into dialogue, transforming tragedy into philosophy, and through those dialogues, apology, Crito, Phaedo, Republic, the world would meet Socrates not as victim, but as victor. The man who refused to write had become immortal through the pens of others. His enemies had accused him of corrupting the youth. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. He had infected them with reason. His execution marked the end of the first age of philosophy, and the beginning of everything that followed. The schools of Plato and Aristotle would trace their lineage to that cell, to that cup, to that calm voice saying that knowledge is virtue and that virtue is worth dying for. Socrates had proven his final argument not with words, but with the act of dying well. He had shown that philosophy was not theory, but character, not speculation, but courage. And as the dawn rose over Athens, the city that had killed him began to understand what it had lost. The morning after the hemlock, Athens woke to silence. No speeches, no applause. No debate, only the uneasy calm that follows an irreversible act. The trial was over, the sentence carried out, and the philosopher who had haunted the conscience of a city was gone. But the echo remained. For those who had seen him die, it was impossible to forget. They had watched him walk into death as if into a conversation, questioning to the very end. They had seen courage that was not born of rage or glory, but of conviction. That image, an old man, calm before poison, would haunt the Western mind forever. In the days that followed, Athens began to feel what it had done. The jurors who voted for his death were jeered in the streets. Some fled, others, ashamed, took their own lives. Within a few years, the city that once condemned him raised statues in his honor. But no monument could erase the guilt. Athens had killed its own teacher. The irony was unbearable. This was the same city that had invented philosophy, that had called itself the light of the world. Yet when faced with the man who embodied that light, it chose darkness. Socrates had called himself a midwife of wisdom. Now his death became the birth of something larger, a new way of thinking about truth, virtue, and the human soul. His student Plato fled the city and began to write. The words poured from him like testimony. He wrote apology to defend his teacher, Crito to capture his refusal to flee, Phaedo to record his final moments. Each dialogue was both memory and resurrection. In Plato's hands, Socrates became more than a man. He became an idea, the embodiment of reason against ignorance, of conscience against crowd. Plato took his teacher's questions and turned them into systems. He built a world of forms, perfect eternal realities that existed beyond the senses, of which our world was only a shadow. Truth, he said, could not be found in opinion or politics, but in contemplation of the eternal. The philosopher, therefore, was not a gadfly, but a guardian, a man who sees what others cannot and suffers for saying it aloud. Through Plato, the death of Socrates became the moral foundation of the Western world. Philosophy was no longer a curiosity. It was a duty. To live well meant to live examined. The shock of that idea rippled outward. Plato's Academy, founded in a grove outside Athens, became the first lasting school of philosophy in history. Its students would shape every generation that followed, from Aristotle, who would tutor Alexander the Great, to the countless thinkers who would inherit the habit of questioning authority. Each saw in Socrates not tragedy, but template Aristotle, practical where Plato was idealistic, built on the same foundation. He made philosophy a method of observation, dividing reality into logic, biology, politics, and ethics. The ethics in particular reads like an echo of Socrates, that virtue is not given by birth or decree, but cultivated by reasoned habit. Even the Stoics, centuries later, under the shadow of Rome, would claim Socrates as their spiritual ancestor. When they preached calm in adversity, discipline in thought, and the power of inner freedom, they were repeating his example. Socrates had shown that no man could truly be imprisoned if his mind remained his own. Athens recovered politically, but not spiritually. Its democracy continued, but it carried a scar. The city had chosen safety over truth, conformity over conscience, a choice that every civilization would face again. When Alexander conquered the world, he carried Aristotle's teachings with him, spreading Greek reason across Asia. When Rome absorbed Greece, it absorbed Socrates too, his story retold in Latin schools, his method embedded in law and rhetoric. Even when empires fell, his ghost remained, walking among ruins, whispering that wisdom begins in doubt. His influence reached beyond philosophy into faith itself. Early Christian thinkers, centuries later, recognized in him a kindred soul, a man who had died for truth, condemned by his own people, executed for blasphemy, yet sanctified by history. To them, he was a pagan prophet, a prefiguration of the martyr, and in a way, he was. For what is a martyr but a person who chooses death rather than silence? In time, the image of Socrates drinking the hemlock would become one of civilization's most enduring symbols, painted by artists, sung by poets, invoked by rebels. In that cup lay not only his death, but the entire philosophy of integrity. To live as Socrates lived meant to accept that truth demands cost. To die as Socrates died meant to prove that cost was bearable. Plato understood this better than anyone. In his later dialogues, he would describe the soul's ascent through wisdom, from ignorance to knowledge, from illusion to light, an allegory born directly from the darkness of that prison cell. In the Republic, he imagined a just society ruled by philosophers, guardians trained to see truth as Socrates had, untempted by wealth or power. It was his way of asking, what if Athens had listened? The irony, of course, is that it never did. The city that killed its wisest man soon lost its empire, its influence, its freedom. Yet the man it executed conquered time. Every era rediscovers him. The Enlightenment saw in Socrates the first citizen of reason, defying superstition with logic. The French Revolution saw in him the voice of conscience against tyranny. The Romantics saw in him a hero of the soul. The modern world sees in him the inventor of skepticism, the man who taught us to ask why. Even now, his method shapes our language, our science, our ethics. When we question, we are his descendants. Socrates' death also changed the very idea of philosophy. Before him, philosophy was a speculation about the cosmos. After him, it became a moral act. To think was to live rightly. To argue was to seek virtue. He turned wisdom inward, and humanity has never looked away since. No city, no empire, no institution could destroy that shift. For once truth had been shown to survive even death, it became immortal. The man who refused to write became the most written about thinker in history. His words, recorded by others, traveled through centuries, crossing language and empire, reaching every corner of a world he never saw. The Library of Alexandria would one day burn, empires would collapse, but the story of a barefoot philosopher who drank poison for his principles would endure. And through that story, the question he asked with his life remains, can a city built on opinion survive a man devoted to truth? Athens answered with execution. The world answered with civilization. Picture Athens at dusk. The marketplace is quiet. The temples glow faintly in the fading sun. On the steps where he once stood, there is no trace of him. No statue, no shrine, no word carved in marble. Just wind and memory, and yet he is still there. Not in body, not even in voice, but in thought. Invisible, unending. For when Socrates died, philosophy did not die with him. It began. The story of his life became something greater than the man himself. A mirror that every age would hold up to its own conscience. He asked a single question. What is the good life? And the world has been trying to answer it ever since. In the centuries that followed, his spirit became the heartbeat of reason. Every thinker who stood against ignorance, every scientist who defied superstition, every writer who dared to question power, they all carried something of him. When Galileo looked through his telescope and told the church that the earth moved, he was answering Socrates. When Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from his prison cell that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he was echoing the same faith in conscience over conformity. When Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela, Malala Yousafzai, and countless others refused silence, they were continuing his trial, proving that ideas, once spoken honestly, cannot be unspoken. Socrates had stood alone before his city, unarmed except for truth, and that image became civilization's permanent archetype of courage. His death defined what it means to be free, because freedom, as he taught, is not the right to do whatever one wishes. It is the duty to think for oneself. Even the modern world, with its machines and screens and endless information, still revolves around his question. Every scientific discovery, every ethical debate, every democracy, every classroom, every courtroom is built on the assumption that questioning authority is not a crime, but a responsibility. That was his real revolution. He turned thinking into a public act. He made philosophy practical, dangerous, alive. He believed truth was not a doctrine handed down from gods or kings, but something that lived between people, in dialogue. Every time we debate, every time we doubt, every time we demand evidence, we are walking in his shadow. And yet, the tension that killed him has never left us. Society still fears the questioner. Every age has its heretics, its dissidents, its whistleblowers, its thinkers exiled for refusing to lie. The names change, the methods change, the stakes change, but the pattern remains. We still live in Athens. Our courts are larger now. Our juries more invisible. Not 500 citizens in a stone chamber, but millions of opinions shouted through the air. The crowd is still here, impatient, emotional, righteous. The accusers still speak loudly, confident that noise equals truth. And somewhere, always, stands a quiet voice asking, but is that just? The death of Socrates reminds us that democracy without reflection becomes its own tyranny. The tyranny of comfort, of haste, of noise. The lesson he left behind is not that he was right and his city wrong, but that thinking is painful and must be done anyway. He warned that ignorance disguised as certainty was the most dangerous force in the world. 25 centuries later, we have more knowledge than ever, and yet the warning still stands. Information is not wisdom. Debate is not understanding. Echo is not thought. Perhaps that is why we keep returning to him. Every philosopher since has been his descendant. Descartes searching for a foundation of certainty. Kant wrestling with duty. Nietzsche demanding honesty. Camus confronting absurdity. Even the scientists, the skeptics, the humanists, they all begin with the same assumption he left us. That reason is sacred and truth is worth dying for. But Socrates did not want disciples. He wanted dialogue. He wanted us to continue his conversation, not canonize it. He believed that knowledge grows only through contradiction, that wisdom comes not from agreement, but from tension. He said once that the unexamined life is not worth living. It is a sentence carved so deeply into the human story that it has outlived empires. It is both a challenge and a warning, that to live blindly is to die without ever having truly lived. And so we keep examining. Each generation, in its own way, picks up the thread where he left it. We argue over what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, the same questions asked beneath the same sky. Perhaps that is why his death feels less like an ending and more like a beginning that never stopped. When we read of his trial, it is hard not to imagine what he would say now, to the shouting, the certainty, the rush to condemn. He would smile, ask questions, and wait for the silence that follows the collapse of arrogance. Then he would ask again. The city might try to silence him once more, but the difference now is that we know what happens next. His words outlast every verdict. His calm defeats every mob. The poison cup has already been drained, and still he speaks. Walk through any university, any courthouse, any laboratory, and you will find him, not in statues but in methods. In the way we test, challenge, and prove. In the way we seek reason before belief. He is the voice beneath the questions that never die. When he said that no harm can come to a good man in life or after death, it was not arrogance, it was prophecy. His body fell, but his voice became immortal. Every person who refuses to lie for comfort or power proves him right. The city killed him to preserve itself. Instead, it preserved him. The execution that was meant to silence him became the reason we remember Athens at all. Civilizations forget their kings, their laws, their wars, but they remember the man who refused to stop asking why. That is the paradox of Socrates. The man who claimed to know nothing taught the world everything. So as you listen to the hum of your own city, the chatter, the politics, the noise, imagine him walking among us still, barefoot, smiling faintly, asking one more question, because that is what philosophy truly is, not a subject, but a posture, not knowledge, but the courage to seek it. The trial never ended. It only changed form. Each of us, in our own time, becomes the jury again, deciding whether we will choose truth or comfort, conscience or convenience. Socrates stands before us, as he always will, and waits for our answer.